Welcome to Minnesota Explorer, a podcast dedicated to bringing you a new adventure somewhere in Minnesota with every episode. Each week we'll travel to a different destination, from scenic state parks and beautiful lakes to fascinating cities, historic places, and hidden gems across the state. If you love discovering new places and planning your next adventure, follow the podcast so you never miss an episode and stop by minnesotaexplorer.com for hand-picked places to explore and gear recommendations that help keep the show going. Now let's explore Minnesota. Today we're heading to Minneapolis, specifically to a place that sits right along the banks of the Mississippi River and tells the story of how a small frontier town became one of the most powerful industrial cities in America. We're talking about Mill City Museum, and it is one of the most genuinely fascinating museums in the state. Mill City Museum is located at 704 South 2nd Street in downtown Minneapolis, right in what's called the Mill District. If you're coming in from the suburbs or from the north, you can jump on I-35W South and take the Washington Avenue exit, then follow signs toward the riverfront. If you're coming from the west or east on I-94, take the 11th Street or 4th Street exit heading toward downtown. The museum sits just a block or two from the Mississippi River, and you'll notice it immediately because it doesn't look like a typical museum. It looks like the ruins of a massive industrial building, because that's exactly what it is. Street parking is available nearby with meters, and there are several city-owned parking ramps within walking distance. The museum is also accessible via Metro Transit bus lines and the light rail system, which makes it very easy to get to without driving if you're staying downtown. As for who this museum is ideal for, really, it's for everyone. History enthusiasts are going to love the deep dive into Minneapolis's industrial roots. Families with kids will enjoy the hands-on exhibits and the Flower Tower elevator experience. Curious road trippers who want to understand why Minneapolis grew where it did and why it became what it became, this is your place. And honestly, if you've lived in Minnesota your whole life and never been here, you're going to leave wondering why it took you so long. Now let's get into the story behind this place, and it is quite a story. The land along the Mississippi River near what is now downtown Minneapolis was not chosen randomly as the site of a great industrial city. The reason Minneapolis exists where it does, and why it grew the way it did, comes down to one very powerful geographical feature: St. Anthony Falls. St. Anthony Falls is the only natural major waterfall on the entire length of the Mississippi River. And in the 19th century, falling water meant mechanical power, which meant industry. In 1874, a businessman from La Crosse, Wisconsin named Cadwallader C. Washburn opened what would become the Washburn Mill on the banks of the Mississippi, just adjacent to those falls. At the time it was completed, it was declared the largest flour mill in the world. The power of the river, diverted through a canal that ran through the lower level of the building, drove the milling machinery that ground wheat into flour. Add in the railroads, bringing grain from the vast prairies of the Dakotas and Minnesota, and the trains carrying finished flour to national markets, and you had a recipe, if you'll pardon the pun, for enormous economic success. Minneapolis became known as Mill City, and eventually earned the title of flour milling capital of the world. The population of Minneapolis was just 13,000 people in 1870. Within 2 decades, it had exploded to 165,000. The mills drove everything. But the story of the Washburn Mill is also a story of disaster. Just 4 years after it opened, on the evening of May 2nd, 1878, catastrophe struck. The day shift had clocked out at 6 o'clock and a 14-man night crew had taken over. An hour later, at around 7 in the evening, a spark ignited airborne flour dust inside the mill. The resulting explosion was heard 10 miles away in St. Paul. In a matter of seconds, a series of thunderous blasts demolished the Washburn A, the largest industrial building in the city, along with several adjacent mills. All 14 men inside the Washburn A were killed. 4 more workers at neighboring mills also lost their lives, 18 men dead. A third of Minneapolis's entire milling capacity wiped out in an instant. What most people don't know is that flour dust, seemingly harmless, something you'd find in your kitchen, can be extraordinarily explosive when it's suspended in the air in sufficient concentration. It's the same principle behind coal dust explosions in mines. The mill's design allowed this combustible dust to accumulate, and when the millstones created a spark, the result was catastrophic. Here's what's remarkable about what happened next. Cadwallader Washburn traveled immediately to Minneapolis upon hearing the news, And the very next day, he announced that he would rebuild. He brought in Austrian engineer William de la Barre, who designed an entirely new mill based on plans from an advanced facility in Budapest. The new design incorporated limestone walls 4 feet thick at the base, a vertical layout that used gravity to move grain from floor to floor, and, critically, dust collectors and improved ventilation systems to prevent the deadly buildup of flour dust. He then shared those safety innovations with his competitors, helping make the entire industry safer. The new Washburn mill was completed in 1880, just 2 years after the explosion. At peak production, it could grind over 100 boxcars of wheat into nearly 2 million pounds of flour per day. Washburn partnered with a man named John Crosby, forming the Washburn-Crosby Company. You may know their most famous product by a different name, gold medal flour. And in 1921, Washburn-Crosby invented a character to answer customer baking questions after a contest in the Saturday Evening Post generated an enormous response. They called her Betty Crocker. Washburn-Crosby would eventually become General Mills, one of the most recognizable food companies in the world, all rooted in this spot along the Mississippi. The mill continued operating until 1965, when changes in transportation costs and milling technology made it obsolete. It sat vacant for decades, a National Historic Landmark listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but crumbling quietly. Then, in February of 1991, fire struck again. The flames went undetected for too long because the neighborhood was largely empty at the time, and by the time firefighters arrived, most of what remained had been destroyed. What was left were scorched concrete floors and crumbling limestone walls. It was those ruins, those dramatic, haunting ruins, that would become the foundation for something remarkable. In the late 1990s, the city of Minneapolis worked to stabilize what remained, and the Minnesota Historical Society announced plans to build a museum not just near the ruins, but within them. Construction began in 2001, and Mill City Museum opened to the public in 2003. The architect Tom Meyer of Meyer, Scherer, and Rockcastle designed a modern building that wraps around and embraces the ruin walls, incorporating them as central architectural features. Original turbine pits, railroad tracks, a train shed, and 2 engine houses were left intact with the new design. The result is a building that is unlike almost anything else in the country, a 21st century museum built inside the bones of a 19th century industrial disaster. The twisted girders, the jagged brick, the weathered limestone, they're not decorations, they're the real thing. So what do you actually experience when you visit? Let's walk through it. The centerpiece of the museum, and the experience most visitors talk about long after they leave, is the Flour Tower. You sit down inside what feels like a restored freight elevator cab, and you're slowly carried upward through 8 levels of the building. As you rise, each floor is designed to look like a working floor of the mill, and you hear the voices of former mill workers narrating what it was like to be here. The noise, the heat, the dust, the danger, the camaraderie. Historic film footage and photographs are projected on the walls, and at one point you hear a thundering boom meant to evoke the 1878 explosion. It's genuinely moving. When you reach the top, you step out onto the rooftop observation deck for a sweeping panoramic view of the Mississippi River, St. Anthony Falls, the Stone Arch Bridge, and the city spreading out around you. The Flour Tower experience is timed and ticketed at the front desk, so when you arrive, head straight there to reserve your spot, then use the remaining time to explore the other exhibits. And there's a lot to explore. The museum also features a film called Minneapolis in 19 minutes flat, shown in the West Engine House, an actual old engine house that has been converted into a small theater. The film was written and narrated by Minnesota storyteller and humorist Kevin Kling, and it takes you on a whirlwind tour of 400 years of the area's history. It's funny, it's heartfelt, and it's actually a wonderful primer on the city of Minneapolis. Don't skip it. There's a water lab where you can experience firsthand how the Mississippi River powered the mills. Hands-on exhibits explain how the falling water of St. Anthony Falls was harnessed to drive the machinery, and it's the kind of demonstration that makes a concept click in a way that a text panel simply cannot. The baking lab is another fan favorite, especially if you have kids in tow. This is where you can see how different varieties of wheat produce different types of flour, and how that affects the final product. Live baking demonstrations happen here, and yes, samples of fresh baked treats are sometimes available. Think of it as the original test kitchen. Flour milling companies actually used rooms like this to test and perfect their products. The main gallery level features exhibits on the history of flour milling machinery, with actual antique equipment on display, as well as the story of how Minneapolis's milling industry shaped the city. There are nods to the big brand names that came out of this place: Gold Medal Flour, Pillsbury, Betty Crocker, with some wonderful vintage advertising and packaging on display. And then there's the Ruin Courtyard, the Charles H. Bell Ruin Courtyard, which is the outdoor space enclosed by the surviving walls of the old mill. If you look closely at the walls and the ground, you can see the footprints of old machinery, the shadows of the mill's former infrastructure. On a nice day, this space hosts events, live music, and is simply a beautiful place to stand and think about what happened here. Some people have actually chosen it as a wedding venue, which tells you something about how atmospheric it is. The museum also hosts a rotating schedule of special exhibits and events throughout the year, including the Mill City Farmers Market, which runs on Saturdays between the museum and the Guthrie Theater next door. In summer, it's weekly. In other seasons, it runs on select Saturdays. If you time your visit to coincide with the market, you can grab fresh local produce, artisan foods, and snacks from vendors before or after your museum visit. It makes for a great morning. For planning purposes, the Minnesota Historical Society recommends allowing at least 2 hours for your visit. Visitors who really want to read the exhibits thoroughly and catch both the Flower Tower and the film often spend closer to 2.5 to 3 hours. The museum is open Thursday and Friday from 10 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, and Saturday and Sunday from 10 to 5. It's closed Monday through Wednesday, except during July and August when it also opens on Mondays. Always check the Minnesota Historical Society website for holiday hours before you go. General admission is $12 for adults, $10 for seniors, students, and veterans, and $8 for children ages 5 through 17. Kids 4 and under are free. MNHS members get in free, and there are periodic free admission days sponsored by the state of Minnesota, worth checking for in advance if you're budget conscious. Bank of America and Merrill cardholders can also check the Museums on US program for free admission opportunities. A few tips for making the most of your visit. First, as mentioned, reserve your Flower Tower time slot the moment you walk in the door. It's the most popular experience and slots fill up. Second, if you're visiting on a Saturday between May and September, factor in time for the farmers market next door. Third, the rooftop observation deck is weather permitting, so if you're visiting in winter or on a rainy day, it may not be accessible, but the indoor exhibits are just as compelling. Fourth, the museum has a gift shop with books focused on Minneapolis history, railways, and cooking. Genuinely good gift material. And finally, the on-site cafe Bushel and Peck offers grab-and-go sandwiches, salads, snacks, and beverages, operated by D'Amico with a farm-to-fork inspiration rooted in the agricultural history of the riverfront. It's a solid option for a quick bite before or after your experience. While you're in the Mill District, 2 things deserve your attention. The first is the Stone Arch Bridge. This historic pedestrian and bicycle bridge stretches 2,100 feet across the Mississippi River, built from native granite and limestone with 23 arches. Originally a railroad bridge built in 1883, it was repurposed as a pedestrian and bike path and is now one of the most scenic spots in the city. Walk it before or after the museum for outstanding views of St. Anthony Falls, the Lock and Dam, and the Minneapolis skyline. It's completely free and easily walkable from the museum. The second is the Guthrie Theater, which sits right next door to Mill City Museum. Even if you're not catching a show, the Guthrie Building is worth a visit on its own. Designed by Pritzker Prize-winning architect Jean Nouvel, the building includes a 178-foot cantilevered observation bridge called the Endless Bridge that extends out over West River Parkway, and you can walk it for free. The views from the Endless Bridge and from the Amber Room on the 9th floor are extraordinary. The Guthrie also has lobby bars and a gift shop open to the public. For dining in the neighborhood after your museum visit, consider heading to Farmer's Kitchen and Bar at nearby 23rd and Nicollet, which offers a locally focused menu in a comfortable neighborhood setting, or explore the broader Mill District and North Loop area, which has a vibrant restaurant scene within walking distance. For lodging, you're in the heart of downtown Minneapolis, so options are plentiful. The Canopy by Hilton Minneapolis Mill District is one of the closest and most convenient, sitting right in the neighborhood. The Renaissance Minneapolis Hotel, the Depot, is another excellent option. It's housed in a beautifully restored historic train depot and is deeply connected to the industrial history of the area, making it a fitting choice thematically. For something with more boutique charm, the Nicollet Island Inn is a short walk away on Nicollet Island in the middle of the Mississippi River. Originally built in 1893 as part of the flour milling district, the inn has been lovingly restored and offers 23 rooms, a highly rated restaurant, and views of both the river and the Minneapolis skyline. It's consistently named among the most romantic places to stay in the Twin Cities, and the setting is genuinely magical. Whether you're a Minneapolis native who has somehow never made it to the museum, a history enthusiast exploring the state, or a family looking for something genuinely educational and engaging, Mill City Museum delivers a Minnesota story that is impossible to forget. From the thunderous explosion of 1878 to Betty Crocker, from the raw power of St. Anthony Falls to the haunting beauty of industrial ruins preserved in the heart of a modern city, this place earns every minute you give it. That brings us to the end of today's episode. Before you go, a few quick things. Subscribe so you never miss a destination. Leave us a positive review to help others find the show. Share this episode with someone who loves exploring Minnesota, and visit minnesotaexplorer.com for travel tips, gear, and everything from today's adventure. Your support there helps make this show possible. Thanks for joining us, and happy trails.